which, because it's 2 years into a 5-year project, it's done a lot of work, come up with a lot of ideas, created a lot of data, hasn't really generated many results yet. So I'm afraid this presentation is kind of going to reflect that a little bit. There will be a lot of ideas in it, but not so much in terms of concrete results. Another thing is we've lobbed in some extra bits as well as the Lake District on, for example, 19th century public health and early modern prostitution, just a little bit of variety, but we'll see how it strings together as we go through, I hope. So I got involved in this really because I'd spent a lot of time working with data that looks like this, tables of numbers, in this case 19th century mortality data, and using GIS for that stuff worked fairly well, but there were two big sets of problems. First of all, it's very good at describing patterns, but not very good at explaining patterns. And secondly, the amount of data that was coming on stream, was enormous. There was a 2013 study that estimated that 90% of the data that were then in existence had been created in the past 2 years. And the sort of data that was coming along didn't fit into tables like this, because it was this sort of material. It was newspapers, it was books, it was images, it was all sorts of things. So it struck me that if GIS was going to stay relevant, it had to be able to cope with this sort of material. And that's why I became interested in how we can shoehorn texts into GIS. So one big-ish part of this project is working with a corpus of Lake District writing. We digitised about 80 texts from very early texts, 1622 up to 1900, and together they come to a little over 1.5 million words, and it's got quite a variety of different things, from the well-known things like Wordsworth and so on, to some quite obscure texts. So we put all them into a large corpus. It looks something like that. So it's basic, just fairly basic text with a little bit of XML markup in it, just to add a little bit of contextual information. Actually, although that's not terribly interesting, getting to that point is the hard point. Once you've got to that, life gets a lot easier and things start to move a lot quicker. What we then do with this material from there is run it through the Edinburgh GeoParser, which automatically identifies place names and critically sticks a latitude and a longitude against them. So you can see that, for instance, we've got Lancaster here, and zooming back a little bit, we've got a latitude and a longitude for it. Similarly, Hornby here has got a latitude and a longitude. So once you've got that, you're well placed to read it into a GIS and start mapping it. This is a map of all of the place names in that corpus. So effectively what it's showing you is where people who are talking about the Lake District tend to concentrate on. It's quite an interesting, but in some ways quite predictable pattern. The kind of obvious urban centres stand out: Kendal, Grasmere, Ambleside, Keswick, Penrith, Lancaster to a point. Some bits need interpreting with a little bit of care. That's Windermere there, whether that's referring to the lake or the town is open to question. Some slightly more obscure places, heading up into Langdale here, down Borrowdale here. Ullswater's quite an interesting area. But there's also some quite large silences in it, particularly over the western fells, largely ignored, and various other areas as well. So you've got this pattern of both where people are going, or rather where they're talking about, and also perhaps the geographies of absence where they're ignoring as well to a certain extent. However, just mapping the place names within text isn't all that exciting in its own right. What you're interested in is what they're saying about those places. That's when our technique from corpus linguistics called collocation comes in. Basically, collocation just says what words are occurring near other words that I'm interested in. So for instance, if we're interested in beautiful, as in beautiful landscapes, word beautiful here. If we then stick 5 words either side of that, we don't find any place names, which is a bit of a problem. If we got to 10 words, which is what's in blue, we find Lord's Island. And if we use the whole sentence, what place names occur in the whole sentence, we go up to 7 place names. So there's a bit of work on exactly how big those bandwidths should be that still needs to be done. But nevertheless, I think that gives a reasonable way into saying that if, in this case, the word a place name occurs in a sentence or within 10 words of a word like beautiful, then it is at least relevant to that search term. And that's the technique we've rolled out on, or been increasingly rolling out, a whole series of adjectives and similar words that the person on Project Chris, who knows about these things, probably be relevant to to Lake District landscapes. So words like beautiful, picturesque, sublime, all the way down to terrifying at the bottom, which actually there aren't any terrifying landscapes in the Lake District, what emerged from that. The only one that's referred to as terrifying is actually Keswick, believe it or not, which may or may not be right. Just to go through three of those in a little bit more detail: beautiful, sublime, and dreary. Where's Dreary gone? Dreary's down there. Dreary is quite interesting because it's mentioned 98 times in the corpus as a whole, but actually collocates to 109 place names. That's because if you get sentences like, I don't know, Kendall and Keswick are dreary, that occurs twice, which is why you get over 100% there. So mapping out these collocations, what you find is this is beautiful. This is where, therefore, where people in the corpus are associating with beautiful. You can see it. A pattern in some ways not wildly different to the pattern we were showing overall. A lot of clustering around Keswick, Grasmere, Ambleside, Windermere in particular is standing out. That's a little bit of a problem though, because what you don't know from that is whether what you're picking out is genuinely what people are saying is a big beautiful landscape, or whether you're just picking out where people are going for the most part and you're just picking out the overall density of place names. So to work around that, we used a technique called Kuhldorff's scatter statistic, which actually tries to evaluate where people are, where the word is occurring more than you would expect it to, given the underlying distribution of place names. The results of that are quite interesting because Keswick drops out of being a beautiful place. It doesn't surprise me if it had been there. The Grasmere and Ambleside remain actually quite one of the most concentrated hotspots, but also an area that emerges as, although it's not very visited, when people do visit it, they do say it's beautiful a lot, is this area on the Kent estuary down here. The other thing this technique allows you to do is identify cold spots, in other words, areas which are not being identified as, in this case, beautiful as much as you might expect. And that's quite interesting as well, because a lot of the western fells, kind of Scaff Fell, the Wasdale area up towards Buttermere, are not being identified as beautiful as much as you'd expect. Do the same for Sublime. Big cluster on Keswick again, but actually an obvious cluster here in exactly the area that we said wasn't being associated with beautiful. And indeed that stands out as a major hotspot, but interesting, the area that is being described as beautiful isn't Sublime. So although these two words would seem to have quite a similar origin, quite similar meaning in some ways, they're actually being used to describe very different landscapes. It's something that starts to emerge from this. Dreary is quite an interesting one as well, and it shows you the danger in part of interpreting maps at face value, because one thing that emerges from this is that the towns look like they're quite often dreary, particularly Kendal. But actually in reality, the towns themselves it isn't the towns that's usually being talked about. What's particularly being talked about is the dreary road from Kendal to Penrith over Shap. So although the map is highlighting the towns because they're the endpoints of the road, the place is actually really being described as dreary is actually the journey between them. So that's where these maps do need, or one area where these maps do need a certain amount of care. Again, if you do Kuhldorff on that, it's quite interesting where it's dreary, because actually an awful lot of the western side of the Lake District appears to be dreary, according to the corpus. An awful lot of the other side of the Lake District, or it's not really the Lake District anymore, it's the eastern side of the M6, moving over into the Howgills and that sort of thing. They come up with dreary quite a lot as well. So where that gets us is we've got this ability to isolate individual words. We're also working techniques that will let you draw them together, because it's quite hard working through 11, 12, potentially many more different words and ways being talking about and trying to compare and contrast with geography. Not quite on that, not quite there on that in terms of having something in presentable shape at the moment, but we're not far away from that. But, so where have we got with that? We've got to a point where we've got, I think, quite good at what's called in the trade distant reading of text. In other words, taking a text, producing a map of it which describes a large volume of text in a very quite simple and understandable way. The limitation with that is that, well, there's two limitations. First of all, as I said at the beginning, maps are very good at describing patterns, but they're not very good at explaining them. So the map on its own is a little bit limited. And the second problem is actually what we've done is we started with this very rich body of data, these texts. We've extracted the place names, we've extracted color codes, and we're ignoring the rest of it. And the English lit people particularly don't like the idea that that's a good thing to do. So what we've tried to do as well is, rather than go down this distant reading, just down this distant reading approach, is to see whether we could use geographical technologies of one form or another to enhance the text rather than replace the text. And that's where this Geotext Explorer comes in. What we've got here is a list of all the texts in the corpus, where we've selected three of them, three different Wordsworth texts that are in there. Press OK on that. And what it then does is give you a map of where those texts are talking about on the left-hand side, but the actual texts themselves on the right-hand side. The idea being that you can read through that, so you hit a place that you're interested in, for instance, Kendal down at the bottom. You can click on that to find out not only where it is, so it's centering on Kendal there, but also where else in the text does Kendal crop up, and what other surrounding areas, what places near Kendal are also being talked about in these texts. So you might then follow up to Windermere over there, and you find out from that where Wordsworth talks about Windermere, and can then follow out one of those hyperlinks to actually find a paragraph where that place name mentioned crops up in. The idea then being that rather than the map replacing the text, the map actually is there to enhance the text and to bring a number of different texts together so that you can read it in a kind of much more geographically friendly way. Even if you know the Lake District quite well, following through all the different place names in it and having an idea of how they interrelate is quite difficult. Another thing that we're trying to do, we haven't actually used that haven't really used that to understand much about the Lake District as well, but I had an intern working for me last summer doing something like this on 19th century public health data. I'm quite interested in changes in infant mortality in rural areas, which I think has been seriously understudied for quite some time. Three places in Suffolk, right next to each other, a place called Risbridge, another place called Sudbury, another place called Sandford, showing very different trends in infant mortality through the 19th century. We were interested in why that might be. I'm not going to go into too much detail on it, but we're interested in why that might be. So what we did was we took the British Library's 19th century newspapers collection, just using their web interface, typed those place names in and typed in, associated them with a lot of different search terms that we thought might be relevant to public health and infant mortality. What we're able to extract from that is really local government seemed to be a critical factor in this. In Risbridge, there was an awful lot of criticism of the structure of local government and the inactivity of local government. Whereas both Sudbury and Sandford actually had quite a lot of detail on how government was being proactive in things like sanitation, improving housing quality, these sorts of things. And I suspect, although it's still slightly tenuous, that there's a lot in that about actually being able to, the importance of local government in helping with driving mortality trends down during the 19th century. But the broader point being that by using text like this, you're actually able to get at information which, if you were just using quantitative sources, would be silenced, because obviously there's not very little quantitative evidence on the role of government. So that was quite an interesting, a little interesting aside in a way of thinking about using text in a slightly different way. There's also kind of in-between stage between those that we're calling geographically enhanced reading. What this involves is starting with close reading to identify where these four different writers, in this case Young, Gray and two Pennantings, where they had been. Places have actually visited. That actually requires reading through the text quite carefully, because just because a place name is there doesn't mean the writer actually went there. But once you've got that, you can then use this cost surface analysis technique to work out where they must have gone to join the places up, because it basically tries to work out the least cost path through quite difficult topography in these cases. And you can therefore work out where the writers were going. So you're moving away from this point-based approach to more of a flow and a route-based approach. And that's quite interesting too, because where you can go from that is start to think about, well, which parts of the landscape were they travelling through and not talking about? Where, again, it's trying to spot these silences. Where are they going and not talking about? Where's not interesting enough to bother naming places? So it's another way of exploring a text, which requires starting with close reading, but then actually involves some quite sophisticated GIS on the top of that. that's kind of where we are with the Lake District stuff. And this might seem a strange thing to say at this stage in a presentation, but I'm not actually stunningly interested in the Lake District. I'm more interested in how we can use large amounts of text to understand particularly 19th century history. But the way these things work, I haven't got anything on 19th century history, but my colleague came to me a few weeks ago and said, I'm interested in prostitution in the early modern period. I didn't want to ask why, but he said, can you do me some maps of that based on early English books online, EBO? EBO has almost every book printed in English between 1473 and 1700 in it. It's about 1.2 billion words, and he wanted me to map it. Well, I didn't want to geoparse the whole lot, but what we could do to do this was type in the search terms that are associated with prostitution. Harlot, whore, and strumpet will come up quite a lot in it. And then just geoparse those. So you're actually then going from 1.2 billion words to a much more manageable volume of collocations. In fact, it's only 872 collocations with whore, 232 with harlot, and a few less with strumpet. Some quite interesting patterns emerge, which I haven't got the expertise to explain. Babylon comes up, doesn't take a lot of working out why that might be. But there's also a lot of religious and classical places. There's a lot of Jerusalems and Bethlehems and Gazas, Rome, Athens. They all seem to come up a lot. I'm not quite sure what's going on there, because this really isn't my period. And then there's also quite a lot in England, which more detail on that down there, which seems to be particularly concentrated in London, but also along southern England, along kind of now the M4 corridor. So again, you've got this pattern where you can describe the pattern within, in this case, a very large volume of text quite quickly. It only took 2 or 3 days to stick these maps together from starting with it. But then you've got the issue of then trying to explain the patterns. But you've got the underlying text there, and hopefully some with some historical knowledge as well. That can then begin to explain the patterns that the GIS work has found. So where do we go from that? Well, as if 1.2 billion words wasn't enough, we're actually working on the British Library's 19th century newspapers collection at the moment to geoparse that and turn that into usable form. I think when that's finished, it's going to be something between 30 and 60 billion words of text, which is going to be an absolutely fantastic resource for understanding local history in England and much further afield through the 19th century. And that will eventually get me back to what I'm really interested in, which is 19th century mortality decline. But we also more recently got some other funding to do a similar job with the Burney collection, which is a collection of used papers and used books, pamphlets and so on from the 17th and 18th century. What that'll give us is everything from 1472 or whatever it was up to 1900, where we've got a significant body, I think, of everything published in English, particularly with the newspapers' focus on it, that we can then explore for these major changes over time and explore those to look at geographical change, geographical attitudes, all sorts of different things. That's the project website down there. Thank you very much.